Week 8 of the NFL season is not going to have any teams on a bye, which is great because we might not need to be so aggressive on the waiver wire this week. But in week 7, because we had so many teams on a bye and dealing with so many injuries, there may have been some owners out there that needed to drop players that they didn't want to, which is great for us because now we may get a discount on somebody that can be fantasy viable for us the rest of the year. So I'd like to welcome you all to Discount Waiver Wire Monday. Yo, what's going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully week 7 went really well for you, and week 8 is about setting ourselves up for future success. We're not going to have to worry about streaming a bunch of guys this week because nobody is going to be on a bye. So when we work the waiver wire this week, we are going to be looking at who can give us the most success for the rest of the season. And with only a few weeks left in the regular season for fantasy football owners, right now, who are some guys that you could get for a potential playoff run? And in the comments down below, let me know the record of your fantasy leagues and whether or not you're preparing for the playoffs or you're still just trying to battle through the coming weeks. Yo, make sure that you have those bell notifications on so whenever the fantasy headliners drop a video, you know about it. We're going to be talking about some running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends that we should be adding to our team, some quarterbacks and defenses that we could potentially stream this week, and a few more guys that potentially should just be dropped. First up will be Justice Hill and Gus Edwards from Baltimore, and they have some really favorable matchups over the next few weeks, starting with Arizona this week. Now, they did well going up against Detroit, who has the #1 rush defense in all of football, and Baltimore exposed them and put that game away pretty early, so there wasn't as many touches that they would have needed later in the game. Justice Hill didn't see a whole lot of work, but he continues to be the red zone guy for this Baltimore defense, and then Gus Edwards, the guy in between the 20s, was even able to find a touchdown this past week. If I had to put these guys in order, I would definitely take Gus Edwards over Justice Hill. But Edwards is owned in more fantasy leagues than what Justice Hill is, so Justice Hill may be more available to you. As much as it pains me to say it, I have to add Zeke Elliott back to the waiver wire video. Unfortunately, he just continues to out-touch Ramondre Stevenson on the ground, which makes really no sense because Ramondre Stevenson continues to be more efficient than Zeke. But when they get in towards the 5-yard line, Zeke is the guy that is coming in now, even though Ramondre scored a goal line touchdown last week in week 6. We'll have to keep an eye on how this split continues to move forward. Ramondre Stevenson seems to be the guy later in games when New England needs pass catchers on the field. But that isn't really giving him a whole lot of upside right now, unfortunately. For those of you in deeper leagues, if Zeke is still out there, he may be flex viable the rest of the season. Chris Rodriguez only ran the ball 7 times for 31 yards this past week, but he definitely looks like he could be coming for Antonio Gibson and that RB2 job. Rodriguez's usage this past week for Washington probably caught a lot of people off guard. And really what it felt like was Washington was just looking for something to jumpstart the offense. They were just trying to do something different, which makes sense, but it also doesn't, because if Washington would have just ran the ball more at the beginning of the game with Brian Robinson, Washington probably wins that game. I don't understand why they continue to throw the ball so much, but that's neither here nor there. Chris Rodriguez is definitely a guy that could be taking over for Antonio Gibson. It already feels like he's starting to on the ground and supplementing Brian Robinson in terms of touches and rushing attempts. Targets will probably still go to Antonio Gibson, but if you're looking for somebody to stash later in the season, Chris Rodriguez might be a decent bet. Bijan Robinson didn't play the entire first drive, and then he only made it out for a few snaps here or there, and he didn't even get his first touch until late in the 4th quarter. And then after the game, apparently they were saying that Bijan didn't feel well and he had a headache, and I really don't know what to tell you, because if the dude was really not feeling well, why wasn't it known before the game? Was Atlanta trying to hide something? At this point, I'm going to put Cordero Patterson on here just for the amount of touches he got in Bijan's absence this week, because who knows if this is something that Bijan holds on to for the rest of the week. Who knows if this was actually disciplinary? Who knows if he's just sick, or maybe he has like concussion symptoms because he got hit in practice. I don't know. And I don't think anybody truly knows what's going on in Atlanta. So you know what? It's better to be safe than sorry. And I'll throw Patterson up here just in case we find out more later in the week. Everybody scrambled to add Zach Evans last week, and then the LA Rams said, gotcha, it's Darrell Henderson and Royce Freeman. Now, Henderson saw the majority of the volume and even a little bit of work in the passing game. And while Royce Freeman saw less touches than Henderson, he was slightly more efficient on the ground. And it seems that these two will be the guys moving forward until Kyren Williams gets back, which will be at least 3 more weeks. If you had to pick somebody out of this group, it is definitely Darrell Henderson. Now, if Royce Freeman continues to be more efficient, then maybe he ends up seeing more touches and then moves up ahead of Darrell Henderson. But as of right now, I do believe it will continue to be Henderson. And right now, he's also a priority add for me this week. Now, if you ended up getting him last week at the end of the week, great for you. Right now, he's still around 45% owned in a majority of platforms. So he's probably going to be gone for a lot of you. But if he's still floating out there, he's probably going to be the #1 waiver pickup for a lot of people this week. Emari Demercado last week seemed to be pushed back to an RB2 role. And then in week 7, he was the main guy. So I'm not really sure what changed over the course of the week, but Emari Demercado put together over 70 total yards yesterday. And that's not bad, especially for those of you hurting at the running back position. Now, he is going to be getting the Baltimore Ravens this week, which is not going to be a great matchup for him. But if you're just looking for somebody to get the volume, Emari Demercado, even though 2 weeks ago he wasn't really looked at on the ground, it was Keontae Ingram, he was utilized in the passing game. And then this past week, he was also utilized in the passing game. So going up against a tough Baltimore run defense, if they have to throw the ball and dump it off to their running backs, Demercado should still be a decent PPR flex option if you're hurting at the position. Tajay Spears really isn't fantasy viable right now. When it comes to his role with Derrick Henry, Spears is on the field quite a bit. He is supplementing Derrick Henry, especially in those negative game script situations, but he's not really putting together fantasy numbers. Really, Tajay Spears is only a guy that if you are in a PPR league and you're really hurting to throw somebody into the flex, then maybe you could do that with Spears. And if I'm a Derrick Henry owner, I'm definitely going to own Spears just in case. But as of right now, there's just no standalone value with just Spears by himself. There's a really good chance that fantasy owners in your league forgot about Devin Singletary. He's coming out of the bye. He hasn't really been fantasy viable, but a couple of weeks ago, he did start to kind of take over that RB role from Dameon Pierce and did play a little bit better. Is that a trend that we continue to see? It's hard to tell right now, but if you have like a late waiver priority, he's a guy that you could go ahead and use that on, and maybe you do get a starter in the next couple of weeks. Or maybe if you're using Fab, you just bet a couple of bucks on him because no one's thinking about him. And once again, in a couple of weeks, if he does continue to take over for Dameon Pierce, you've got a starter for dirt cheap. We mentioned Pierre Strong a couple of weeks ago because he saw some decent usage on the ground, and then he didn't really get used after that, which makes sense because Jerome Ford and Kareem Hunt have played just fine over the last couple of weeks. But now Jerome Ford is dealing with an ankle injury, and as of this recording, we don't know how long it could potentially hold him out for. But also last week, Kareem Hunt late in the week became a game time decision, and we didn't know until Sunday morning whether he was going to play or not. Pierre Strong is definitely a candidate for double-digit carries if Jerome Ford ends up missing and Kareem Hunt isn't 100%. Now, Kareem Hunt is not listed here because he went well over 60% this past week, but if for some reason he is still available in your league, it would definitely be Kareem Hunt before Pierre Strong. All right, I've got another stash candidate for you. Not someone we're going to start right away, but if you're a Tony Pollard owner, adding Rico Dowdle might not be the worst thing in the world right now. Tony Pollard has been pretty underwhelming so far, and it's not really his fault. This offense as a whole just is not clicking for Dallas right now. But when you take a look at the usage that Tony Pollard has had so far this season, he's definitely on pace for career highs. As the end of the season starts to get a little bit closer, there is a potential that maybe Pollard would miss a game or two or does see a decreased role just to get him ready when Dallas makes a playoff run. So if you own Pollard, just keep Dowdle in the back of your mind, or if you have larger benches, I would even add him now just to secure that handcuff if something were to happen. We only have a handful of wide receivers to talk about this week, but we have some really good ones also that may still be available on your waiver wire. I don't think Odell Beckham Jr. is a guy that we're going to start right now, but it was interesting that his 7 targets led the team this past week against Detroit. The biggest issue with Odell Beckham Jr. is that he's a guy that just continues to be banged up. I still look at Zay Flowers as kind of being the wide receiver 1 on this team, and then you have Mark Andrews as just the beast that he is out at the tight end position, but you're working at a lot of different wide receivers right now along with him. So is he going to give you consistent production? Probably not, but this Baltimore offense has looked really good in the passing game this year. Josh Downs caught 5 of his 6 targets for 125 yards and a touchdown this past week. And how this guy is still under 50% owned across multiple fantasy platforms is beyond me. Yeah, the majority of his production came on that one big touchdown pass this past week, and his targets weren't really as high as what they've been in the previous 2 weeks, but Minshew continues to look his way early and often, and like I said, he's got that big playability. He was a breakout type performer that I had put in our draft guide at the beginning of the season, so if you've been following us and bought our draft guide, you're really not surprised by Josh Downs, but hopefully that means you also added him already and you're not going to be fighting over him this week. Last week when I did my waiver wire video, Kendrick Bourne was just over 60% owned on multiple platforms. He's dropped to 40% this week, which is absolutely insane. Given the bye weeks and the injuries, how is it that his ownership percentage went down? The only thing I can think of is that people were scrambling to add running backs because they were dealing with injuries, or they didn't like the Buffalo matchup, so they figured they would dump him and try to add him back this week. But after another good performance and another touchdown, people are going to be jumping all over Kendrick Bourne this week. And if I were you, if you haven't dropped him yet, I definitely would try to get him back, and he needs to be well over 70% this week, because this is a guy that's giving us wide receiver 2 type numbers this season and is somebody that we should be able to start, possibly even in the flex. It's about time that Jalen Hyatt started to see a little bit of an increase in his workload. And a guy like Ty God Taylor, yeah, you heard me correctly, not Tyrod, Ty God Taylor has the arm to go down the field. Even back to his Buffalo days, he can be a little bit more of a game manager, but when they take those shots down the field, he has pretty decent accuracy and he's got the arm to reach down there. Who knows when Daniel Jones will end up feeling healthy enough to come back? It could end up being another week or two. Who knows? He could end up being back this week as well. Jalen Hyatt, to me, has fantasy value with Tyrod Taylor. If it's Daniel Jones, maybe not so much. But you're going to want to try and grab him before the breakout happens, because if it does, he'll probably be one of the most sought-after candidates on the waiver wire. Jackson Smith-Njigba made his way onto the waiver wire video last week, knowing that DK Metcalf was banged up. And he ended up scoring a touchdown and going over 60 yards for you if you picked him up and played him. But we don't know Metcalf's status moving forward either. Really, JSN, who was my wide receiver 1 in the draft, and I absolutely love him, still doesn't have a ton of value for me if DK Metcalf actually plays. He's seeing some snaps, but he's just not seeing the targets. It's Lockett, it's Metcalf, and then they're running the ball with Kenneth Walker. So if Metcalf misses, then JSN could be another good candidate for you. But if Metcalf plays, then JSN is probably going to be regulated back to the waivers. After missing week 6 with a concussion and then being on the bye in week 7, Tank Dell's ownership percentage dropped down into the mid 40s. Another wide receiver that should be owned and has been highly owned being dropped in week 7. And that's why I called this week discount waiver wire week, because there are going to be guys that you could get your hands on that if it had not been for the amount of buys and injuries last week, you probably would not be seeing them. They would be stashed somewhere. Tank Dell has some pretty decent matchups coming up as well. If I were you, he would be one of the top priority ads in all of fantasy football this week. Spend some fab, use your waiver wire priority, get yourself some Tank Dell. Josh Reynolds and Jameson Williams have some really nice matchups coming up. They've got Las Vegas on Monday Night Football in week 7. They'll be on the bye in week 8, and then in week 9, they'll have the Los Angeles Chargers. So when you take a look at these two guys, Reynolds will definitely be the safest option. He sees more targets than Jameson Williams and runs more routes than Jameson Williams. Jared Goff loves Josh Reynolds. So if you needed to go for a safe floor, Reynolds is probably going to be your guy that you would play in these matchups. Jameson Williams saw a really nice jump in his route percentage this past week. It was only 9 routes 2 weeks ago to 26 routes this past week against Baltimore. Now, some of that could have been because of the score, and he was needing to be on the field more often because Detroit just couldn't run the football down as much as they were. So just keep an eye on that in the coming weeks. But his big playability could be showcased over the next couple of matchups. Wan'Dale Robinson, to me, is more of a PPR guy. When you take a look at his targets in week 5 and 6, they look to be on the uptick, and he's not getting a ton of yards, but he's definitely getting the target share that would allow you to use him in a PPR league as like a wide receiver 3 or like a second flex option. This past week, his targets dipped all the way down to 2, which is definitely concerning. But given the game script being on the positive side for the New York Giants for once this season, it definitely could have been an outcome from the score. I don't see the Giants being in too many positive game script situations moving forward though, so Wan'Dale Robinson could be going back to a PPR play with a safe floor. All right, for tight ends, we're going to scroll through a few options here pretty quick, starting with Michael Mayer. Definitely saw a drop in his targets this past week against Chicago in a game script that should have led to more targets, but he still played in 92% of snaps this past week, which is good for him moving forward, even if he doesn't have the ceiling we would like. If you've been watching us, you know that I have a huge issue with Taysom Hill being listed as a tight end for fantasy purposes. But here's the kicker. Over the last couple of weeks, he's actually being used as a receiver, which means we can use him as a tight end. He's not just relying on like a goal line touchdown. Taysom Hill is actually seeing a decent amount of targets right now, which was not true in previous weeks. So guess what? Taysom Hill is actually probably a top 12 option for me as long as Juwan Johnson continues to miss. And maybe even when Johnson comes back, Taysom Hill continues to be used because he's thriving in that role right now. He's playing in the slot more often. And again, he's actually being utilized as a receiver, which when we're looking for tight end targets, that's exactly what we would want. As long as he stays in this type of situation, I'll stay on board with Taysom Hill. Dalton Kincaid had a semi-breakout performance, catching all 8 of his targets for 75 yards in a tough matchup, but with Dawson Knox still being there, it does limit his upside. You've got Gabe Davis, who saw 5 targets but didn't produce a whole lot, and then of course, Stephon Diggs. Dalton Kincaid hopefully becomes a guy that even if he doesn't reach the ceiling, if he's getting 8 targets a game, he could become a decent floor PPR option. Jonnu Smith had a down week against Tampa Bay, but Tampa Bay does a pretty decent job of defending tight ends, so it doesn't surprise me. He still continues to be one of the safer tight ends in football, given the amount of targets that he gets. And looking at Atlanta's offense, they're starting to throw it a little bit more. The passing game is starting to thrive a little bit more, and because of that, Jonnu Smith should continue to have a decent floor. Trey McBride may have taken the tight end 1 role from Zach Ertz this past week. Now, I'm still not 100% sure because their snap percentages haven't come in yet, but when you take a look at what he did in terms of targets, he did out-target Zach Ertz. Be mindful of this over the coming weeks, especially if and when Kyler Murray returns. Gerald Everett has played in over 70% of the snaps the past 2 weeks in this Chargers offense, and he saw a touchdown for his 2nd straight game. He's becoming a utilized part of this offense, given the fact that Quentin Johnston really has not broken out as of yet, and there's no Mike Williams. Josh Palmer will be the deep threat. Keenan Allen will continue to get lots of targets. Austin Eckler will be worked into the passing game, but Gerald Everett is the one guy that will be a mismatch if they put him out in the slot. Jake Ferguson is a really interesting case for me because when you take a look at his usage, he's running a lot of routes, he's playing a ton of snaps, but his production has dropped over the last 3 weeks. In 3 of 4 games to begin the season, he saw 7 targets. And after his big 7 target, 7 reception for 77-yard game, his production has just gone downhill since then. Who knows why? But at this point, it's something to keep an eye on. Hopefully coming out of the bye, we can get back to like that 6-7 target range, because if we do, it makes him fantasy viable. If it doesn't, It makes him non-fantasy viable. Logan Thomas really isn't a roster stash for me right now. He's more of a tight end that I look at as a good streaming option. And going up against Philadelphia this week, Sam Howell's probably going to have to get rid of the ball pretty quickly. And if he does, that's going to be Logan Thomas territory. He's going to have some touchdown upside if Washington can move the football this week, but hopefully he sees a decent amount of targets to give us a good floor. All right, it's time for us to go streaming. It's time for us to go streaming. Let's talk about some quarterback options first. CJ Stroud is coming out of the bye, going up against the #1 draft pick this past year in Bryce Young. And CJ Stroud is 4th in the league in passing. You don't think Stroud is going to want to come out and show Carolina, hey, you should have drafted me? Stroud is a great streaming option this week. New Orleans offense has been pretty inconsistent this year, but when you take a look at the numbers, Derek Carr is still 6th in the league in passing yards. Indianapolis's defense can be hit or miss sometimes. They'll get after you and they'll slow you down, and other times they're giving up some big plays. So if you're looking to stream a quarterback this week, Derek Carr could end up being a decent option. Decent ceiling, but the floor could be a little bit lower, especially if you throw some interceptions. This is just a quick reminder that Kyler Murray may still be out on your waiver wire. If you play in a superflex or a 2-quarterback league, he was probably drafted and he's not available to you. But if you play in a 1-quarterback league, especially like a 14 team or a 16 team, and you've had some inconsistencies at the quarterback position, I would grab Kyler Murray and just stash him on your bench for right now. His window to practice has been open, so it could still be a couple of more weeks before he gets into game action. But putting him on your bench, given the potential upside when he does return, it could be a good stash for you. The Atlanta offense has looked much better in the passing game over the last couple of weeks as they start to utilize that a little bit more often. And if it had not been for some fumble issues this past week, Desmond Ridder actually would have been one of the top scoring quarterbacks of the week. He's still running the football a little bit, giving you some yards on the ground. He scrambles and he moves really nice, but the passing yards are the thing that we've been waiting on, and those have gotten a lot better. Going up against Tennessee this week, he could be a really good streaming option. I got 3 teams that we're potentially looking at streaming this week, and I'm going to kick it off with Jacksonville. The Pittsburgh Steelers played a little bit better on offense this past week, but Jacksonville's defense continues to be one of the more underrated defenses in all of football, especially stopping the run. Pittsburgh is going to have their hands full trying to score on Jacksonville this week, and since Jacksonville played on Thursday Night Football, they're going to have a little extra rest as well to be ready for this game. Jacksonville is a great streaming option against Matt Canada's offense. Detroit's defense got absolutely torched by Baltimore, and it's probably going to lead to a lot of people dropping them if they were trying to utilize them. But they're going to be getting Las Vegas at home this week. That's absolutely a dub in our books. And the Chargers defense, especially given the fact that they just went up against Kansas City, is not widely owned either, but they're going to get the Chicago Bears this week. And even though Las Vegas really had a tough time stopping them, the Chargers defense is a whole lot different than Las Vegas. The Chargers actually have a probability of creating some havoc in the backfield, shutting down the run, and making Badgett make some mistakes. All right, a few guys that we can probably just go ahead and drop for right now, and Zach Evans is going to lead this category. A lot of people probably spent a ton of fab and a high waiver priority last week to add him, and then Royce Freeman and Darrell Henderson were signed and added to the active roster, and then both outplayed Zach Evans substantially this past week. If you're thinking about holding Zach Evans until Kyren Williams gets back, I wouldn't even worry about wasting a roster spot with him. Keontae Ingram was the guy a couple of weeks ago, and he looked like he was going to be the starter this week as well, and then Emari Demercado ended up being the guy instead. Demercado sees a lot more work in the passing game than what Ingram did, and he was definitely utilized more on the ground. Ingram, who was a decent stash for those of you waiting on James Conner to get back, isn't really worth the roster spot anymore. Zach Ertz, who was getting a ton of targets to begin the season, looks to have been surpassed by Trey McBride as the #1 tight end in Arizona. If that's true, Zach Ertz isn't even going to be fantasy viable anymore, because Trey McBride isn't really fantasy viable yet either. Samaje Perine has absolutely lost his role as RB2 to Jaleel McLaughlin. McLaughlin is seeing more work on the ground than what Perine is, being right behind Javonte Williams. But the tough part about this is that even though Samaje Perine saw a little bit more work in the passing game this past week than McLaughlin, he didn't see much as Javonte Williams. They got Javonte Williams working in the passing game a little bit. P. Ryan is not fantasy viable and is the RB3 in Denver now. Chris Rodriguez is coming for that RB2 role, and that's really going to kill any value that Antonio Gibson had. If you play in a deep PPR league, then maybe keep an eye on him and hold on to him just a little bit longer to see if they get him working in the passing game over Chris Rodriguez still. But if you play in any type of shadow league or anything lower than PPR, we can't even worry about him now. Well, there you have it, Headliner Nation. Hopefully my Week 8 waiver wire video is going to help you to establish some depth on your team. And like I said, there are a few players out there right now that shouldn't even be available in leagues. And if you can get a discount on them, it's going to potentially be the difference between you making the playoffs and not making the playoffs. So spend wisely and use those waiver priorities wisely this week. Before you get out of here though, do me a favor, hit the like button. It's free, it's easy, and it helps promote the video a ton. And then of course, leave me a comment down below. I mentioned it at the beginning of the video. Let me know your current fantasy records. Are you vying for a playoff spot? Do you almost have one locked up? Are you still in the middle of the pack, or are you trying to play spoiler right now? Let me know down in the comments. And make sure you have those bell notifications on and subscribe if you're new here. I'm gonna get out though. Headliner Nation, peace out, stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.